Hey, what's going on, folks? It's Mike here, and welcome to the next lesson in the Deep Programming Language series. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about functions again, and this time talking about functions to sort of introduce us to some of the higher order programming things that we can do in programming languages. But we're going to start simple here, just talking about the idea of local functions. So let's go ahead and take a look with an example. So what I've got here is my main, and what I'm going to go ahead and do here is make the font nice and large so you can see. But let's go ahead and just create a function here. I'm just going to call a call, for instance. And I think we're relatively familiar with how function calls work. So I just go ahead and do this. And let's go ahead and maybe pass in some arguments here. Int I, int j. And we could pass in some values here, 0 and 1, for instance. And just to make sure that this works, we can see that our program works just fine. Now, the idea here, again, has in part to do with scope. So I've got this function here, and it's created at the global scope. Main is also a function at the global scope, and they can call each other. But sometimes what I might want to do is actually within the call function define some additional functionality. So here is where I can create a local function or a nested function. And depending on what programming language you've worked with, this will be a relatively familiar idea. Or in fact, sometimes it just depends on the compiler you've worked with in different languages. But this idea that I can go ahead and create a local function here within call here. Okay, and I'll go ahead and compile this and we'll see that it works. Now, again, our scope rules are the same here. So let's just go ahead and try to see, can I call local function? And while my auto-completion might find this when I run it, well, again, this isn't exposed at the scope. So again, local function is just within call here. So oftentimes what you might do is create some local function to do some sort of helping functionality. So for instance, I'm going to make this relatively simple here. It's just going to increment each of the parameters. Let's give it a better name here and call it increment. And we'll actually, let's write out the value of I and j here. And let's go ahead and give ourselves a little bit of formatting here. And let's make it look nice. Let's do I colon and j colon, just so you can see here. Let's go ahead and see what happens. So we have 0 and 1. So the initial thing here to see is that I'm not getting any compiler errors here because I and j, again, falls within the scope of this function here. Okay, so we're allowed to access things as needed here. But I haven't done any of the work here, so I need to actually call this function here, increment, and let's just call it a few times just so we can see the point of how this works. Let's call it twice here, and I'll go ahead and execute it, and you can see that, well, again, increment is executing here, plus plus for I, plus plus for j, and incrementing our values. So there's a few different ways to think about this local functions, or what I'm the purpose of this video, I suppose. One is just to show you this is possible in the deep programming language. This ability to create local functions nested within other functions, and the normal scoping rules apply. You get access to the variables in the context here. And by context, I mean the actual context of this frame here, again with the scope here. We again, if you have watched videos on the stack and so on in the playlist, I and j are available, all throughout this function until we, of course, return. But the second point is this idea of writing little helper functions. Now, in some programming languages, for instance, in JavaScript, for instance, if you're coming from that background, you might nest functions within other functions and create this sort of behavior. It's almost like an object-oriented or behavior here in this way. And sometimes we do this to sort of make it easy to just do some work. So sometimes we do it with a name function, and sometimes we don't need to actually name our function. So sometimes we might just do something like auto, fn, just as an abbreviation for some function. And then we can actually, in a one-liner, which is called a lambda in the deep programming language, do something like take in any arguments that we want. In this case, I'm not going to use any, and then just go ahead and do something like I++. So I can just show you that that compiles, and then again, we could call this function here, which just increments I a few times. Again, now we're at 4 here. So this is known as a lambda. And again, it's getting to this idea of a sort of locally defined function. And that's the sort of symbol here, fn, for this functionality that we want to do. Again, accessing some of the variables in the same context here. Now, if we want to do more than a one-liner, we can, of course, expand this out here. And we can do something like this. And have, some two-liners here, again, just to show you that it compiles. And we've effectively replaced our local function here. Let's just call fn. Let's just call it a bunch of times here. Again, you could do this on the same line if you'd like. And again, you can see it's still doing the same work of our increment, just through this newly created function here that exists in this context. So, I mean, that's getting to sort of a similar idea of this increment here, and some of the ideas that I want us to be talking about later in this series. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss those. But again, maybe instead of just creating this function here, since I already have it, I could do something like auto fn equals the address of increment. And then I can actually just call function, just like we did here. Okay, so a couple of different ways to think about local functions, how they operate in some different mechanisms. If you haven't seen this, I mean, this is fine to just sort of nest functionality here. And again, you can imagine implementing some sort of sorting algorithm and have some helper functions or something here that help sort of make your work easier or divide that problem up in a meaningful way. That's sort of one way to think about it. But where we're probably going to move a little bit, and you'll see this later in this series, especially as we work with things like the standard library and the algorithms libraries, is this idea that sometimes we just need to create a little function here, and then they'll be actually useful to pass those functions into other functions that operate through these function pointers or delegates, which we're going to talk about. So anyways, this is a video really about just introducing the local function functionality available in the D programming language. You can find all the other videos here on the D series if you want to follow along. And I hope that was useful and kind of transitions us to thinking about functions in different ways and their power. The truth is mastering how functions work, meaning some of these different tools that we can use, for instance, passing functions inside of functions, checking for things like function purity, and these types of things can help us write some better code and more stable software. So it's nice to know D has these tools, and we are going to explore them in these series. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to engage in the discussion below. Otherwise, I'll look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.